Welcome to another episode of The Laundry. Today we'll be talking about the future of KYC, and with us we have Martin Walker from PA Consulting. Now, you work with data and analytics, and that's been part of a large part of your career this far. But it's also spanning KPMG, Nordea, and also the KYC utility Invidem project. Welcome to The Laundry. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So first off, what is your focus these days?
My focus is helping clients solve their KYC challenges, typically through the use of technology and a lot of work around sort of remediation. So more the combination of the tactical side, how do we understand the problem, through to the strategic side, which is what do we need to do to fix our processes, our technology, in order to get really transformative change to their KYC processes.
Brilliant. And when you say tactical issues or mapping out sort of the tactical issues, how do you actually go about doing that?
The starting point is usually clients understand they've got a problem, but they don't really understand the size and the scale of the problem. So the starting point often is to say, well, what does compliant look like, or what does good look like, or what is good enough in your industry? And that typically starts off with understanding what are the policies, what are the processes, what are the procedures, and what are the standards you have for doing KYC. And then secondly, it's an analysis of the data of the customer data to understand what KYC data they've got and what the gaps are. And thirdly, it's then looking to say, well, where are the gaps in your process that you have today? How do we then go about helping you prioritize what order you should do things? Because you've got a combination of the customers may have got a backlog in their data. They may have got some fundamental shortfalls in their processes, such as around how they onboard data, or how they onboard customers, or how they do ODD. And it's just like, where do you actually start? Should we be offboarding customers? Should we be changing our onboarding process? Should we be doing a remediation of our KYC data? Where should we start? And it's all about helping the clients kind of slice the elephant in understanding what is it they've got and what order do you do things.
And when slicing that elephant, what part of the elephant do you usually find to be the most common problem these companies have?
I think the starting point is often what is good enough. So what kind of you can have a policy that is very high level that says kind of what you need, what the KYC or what should be done. But then when you get down to the operational level, you've always got the conflict between the commercial reality, which is we want to onboard as many customers and have as many profitable customers as possible, versus the compliance processes, which is, well, what kind of KYC do we need to do on those customers, and how do we create a very smooth customer experience in the meantime? KYC is it's obviously a necessity from a society point of view and from a legal point of view, but it adds a number of extra process steps that are often seen as inconvenient for both the customer and for the financial institution. So it's about how do you get the balance of what is enough that you need to do that doesn't turn the customer away, or you can explain to the customer why you're doing it, but at the same time ensures that you're doing the right thing as mandated by law and your responsibilities as part of the financial infrastructure.
Absolutely. Do you think there's a competitive advantage to be had there, though, now that more companies are needing to be regulatory compliant? Meaning that if you're really good at your KYC, you actually end up with a winning position as opposed to the companies who lack sort of the processes to support fast onboarding.
I think there's a combination. There's a competitive edge from one is if you can give a smoother client experience as possible, then there is a competitive edge, and how you look at your processes and your technology will give you a competitive edge in that area. And likewise, as we look at more ESG and the environmental, kind of the social responsibilities, particularly the social, if you look at the reaction, for example, around how large corporates have behaved during the Ukraine war, the consumer opinion, if you're seen to be having the wrong customers, that can do your brand a lot of damage. So I think by understanding your customer and making sure you're doing business with the right customers will give you competitive advantage, because if you get that wrong, that can do your brand no end of damage. So I think in the short answer is yes.
Yeah, great. We're definitely aligned on that part. Now, how did you end up actually working with financial crime and working in the realms of KYC?
So if I think back to my career way back when I was in the UK, I had my first experience of working with KYC, which was because I worked for an audit firm, whenever we used to onboard customers, we had to do a very thorough KYC process. So it was long before the HSBC scandals around the Deferred Prosecution Act and so on. This was just par for the course as to how we needed to do business as an audit firm. And then I remember we did a first project for one of the big global banks in the UK back in, what it must have been 2007, 2008, where they realized that they needed to sort their KYC processes out, and we were brought in to help them because we had that experience of being an audit firm and how we had to do KYC there. And then more recently, I started working KYC in more earnest when I left Nordea, when I joined Invidem, which is the KYC utility.
Brilliant. And how have you seen AML, KYC, and compliance sort of evolve throughout the years that you've been working with it?
I think it's funny because if I look in the UK is a very prescriptive culture that says you must do this, you must do that. And as a simple example, if you look at the COVID restrictions in the UK, it was you can have two families together, but they're allowed to meet outside, but not inside. But there's a maximum of 8 people, but no more than 10 people. And it was very, very super prescriptive. And whereas in Sweden, there were half a dozen guidelines. And it's a very similar thing with KYC and regulations. As in the UK, put out by the FSA, you get quite prescriptive guidelines around what you need to do from a financial crime at KYC AML perspective. But in Sweden, it's a lot more open and guideline based, even though we still have kind of a global set of regulations or a European set of regulations. So I think as the Nordic countries have been, I guess, sucked into the AML crisis through the Baltics, there's been the expertise to help the Nordic countries solve their problems has come typically from the UK, and prior to that maybe even the US, and taken their experience and bringing it into the Nordic culture. And there's a bit of a cultural shock because the UK way for compliance is very box ticking, but it's very prescriptive in what you have to do. And the Nordic way is a lot more trusting and open to individuals. So I think the Nordics is having to take on a lot more, they're having to find the happy medium between what level of prescription do you need to do and getting a lot more command and control type processes in place to make sure people actually follow those processes, which is more of an Anglo-Saxon culture. So I'm seeing a lot of change in mindset or a big cultural change in the Nordic banks as they have to adapt to more this prescriptive approach.
Brilliant. Super interesting. And sort of the trends for KYC, what are you seeing now? What's happening in the KYC realm these days that will affect the future of it?
The big term that's being used at the moment is a risk-based approach. So how do you go from a one-size-fits-all, you must follow the standard process and the same process for every client, through to how do you really understand the risks that a particular client poses, and how do you then put in the right level of due diligence into those clients. And when you just look at the volume, the complexity of many of the entities that you deal with, the global nature of them, and the amount of data that's out there, it's about how do you use the data that's available in order to become more effective in your analysis of the customer. Because if you just rely on human beings to go through and do things manually, you're just going to drown and you're not going to be effective. So it's about picking the right customers to aim at, and then using data in a smart way to get the insight into those customers.
Yeah, we see that a lot as well with some of the clients we work with the lack of data in during especially the onboarding phase, turning out to be a huge problem further down in the value chain, as sort of, for example, the transaction monitoring comes into play, but you have no way of differentiating what type of clients to prioritize first, or what kind of flags you should prioritize first. And using external data, we see huge potential in sort of the way a future KYC setup, from a data perspective, I mean. But I'm curious to learn sort of in your mind, what does the future of KYC hold?
I think that if you were to look at how data is used by, if you want to say, social media companies, and how they really have a good understanding of their customers, and they've identified the key data points, and they look at the customer behavior, they have advanced insight into their customers. And I think that's where the banking world is going to be going, and the KYC world is going to be going, is saying, how do we bring together that data, which is a combination of the external data combined with the transaction patterns, to build up a really good understanding of our customers, and then identify which ones of them are potential criminals versus which ones are normal business activity. And the challenge with that is the quality of the data. Just in my time at Invidem, the Nordic KYC utility, we were looking to understand how do you essentially map and understand what data is available in the different Nordic corporate registers, and how do you get access to that data. And they all have slightly different data models, i.e. they store different data, and it's all stored in a slightly different format, and in some cases you can get hold of the data for free, in other cases you have to pay for it. It's the quality of the data that is the single biggest challenge that financial institutions have in making sense of their customers. And it's about how do you understand where the limitations in the data quality is.
Absolutely. And we're pretty privileged sort of living in the Nordics when it comes to data access as well, as opposed to a lot of other countries. And still we have a problem as well trying to map all the different sources and make sense of it. At Strise, we've done excessive work on sort of mapping out the same and tying all these data sources to the knowledge graph, which we use as the base technology for the entities, meaning the persons and the companies. But still we see that even though sort of from a technological standpoint, we feel we have a solution now that really fits sort of fits a lot, or sort of solves a lot of the problems. But it's super interesting to learn more on the data implementation side from a project perspective, because I know you've worked a lot on implementing different data systems through your career as well. What do you see as sort of the biggest challenges in implementing new technology in these big companies?
I think that there are a few things. If you just start off from a data point of view, let's just say as part of a onboarding process, we want to pre-populate some customer fields when you're onboarding a customer. So you can, let's just say that they can enter their company name, for example, and then you can provide their address, you can provide their telephone numbers, contact details, and so on. The starting point is, depending on how many countries you are, or which countries the customers can come from will depend on the number of sources you need to integrate. So just as a very simple example, if I want to enter a postcode in the UK, then I'd need to go and integrate a UK postal code system. If I want to enter a postcode in Sweden, I'd need to integrate into a Swedish system. So as corporate organizations start wanting to offer services to more and more global customers, so the data integration challenge becomes greater. And as part of that, you then need to say, well, how do we validate the data that we're getting from these customers? How do we validate whether the beneficial owner is who they say they are? And as you say, in the Nordic sources, we've got a lot more open data. We have beneficial ownership registers, whereas if you go to many other countries, that data is either not available or it's very, very difficult to access. So the actual practical side of building the integrations to all of these different sources, and then saying, how do I map a postcode in the UK or a zip code in the US to a standard field? It just takes a lot of work to do, because you need to have it. When you build a system, you need to have a sort of almost perfection when it comes to those data mappings. When a human does it, they can use their common sense to adapt something. So they can do a random lookup and go and say, well, in this case, I can go and look up the data from X, Y, and Z. But you need to create rules for all of that in systems. And those last, if you want to say 20% of rules, can get very, very complicated. Or you use AI and machine learning, of which you still need the base data to learn from in order to predict what the answer is. So I'd say it's the breadth of data that makes the implementation of the system difficult. And then the second part is the actual people and process of getting people to change how they think, and working in a new way is extremely challenging as well.
Absolutely. Do you find there's a lot of pushback from sort of internal stakeholders in different departments within these companies that makes implementation of new technological solutions take more time than it actually needs?
You've got a multitude of factors involved there. If you just look at the first line in a bank, you've got first line who want to do as much business as possible, and then you've got sort of second line in the compliance team, whose job it is to make sure that first line are doing the right business, and they continually will be looking to put more controls in place. So straight away, just there before you involve any technology, you've got a conflict that is always there. Then you bring in the technology side, and you've got the IT team, where you've got people who are attached to previous systems, and you talk about changing out new systems, so they may feel jobs at threat. They may not be used to change. So you've got a real multitude of challenges around implementing new regulatory technology, which brings together a whole set of different conflicts. And how you manage that is very, very complicated. Let's not pretend this is a straightforward job. It's a very, very complicated job.
Absolutely. But still, what would your top tips be for companies that has these challenges? And still, since there's a lot of different departments and different stakeholders that needs to be convinced and all aligned, how do we go about actually getting everybody on board?
I think you need to start, again, it comes up with the good old-fashioned, it's the requirements, it's the business case. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And from a compliance side of things, what is the right standard that we need? If you don't have a data standard up front, you can throw all the technology at it, and you're not going to get very far. So I'd say it all starts off with having a good KYC standard that has been bought into by the business, that says this is going to be we can work with this, and it's bought into by compliance to say this is going to get us to a place of regulatory safety.
And when you say KYC standard, you mean the actual platform that?
No, I mean literally a document. So a document that says for these different types of entities, these are the data points we need. This is how we need to do any verification. this is the kind of, yeah, this is what we need to do in order to verify the data that we've got from the customer. These are the timelines within which we need to do operational due diligence, and thinking about the KYC as a process that starts off from kind of the onboarding through to the operational due diligence through to the offboarding, and how that looks as a whole. I think if you go straight into the technology implementation and you don't have agreement on what that process and what the standard looks like behind that process, you're going to run into a lot of problems.
One of the key elements or key phrases we see a lot now is this continuous KYC and inherent perpetual KYC,
Yeah.
that as an integral part of sort of the entire life cycle. First off, what is your take on what a perpetual KYC system is, and how do we get into actually implementing and having that set up?
Yeah. My take on perpetual KYC is it is when the KYC process is able to receive appropriate alerts to changes to an entity and being able to make smart decisions around what that means. So what I mean by that is there could be a change to a company's address. They may move from one street and another to Stockholm. Within Stockholm, it's like, okay, that's interesting, but that doesn't change that probably doesn't change the risk rating of the customer. Whereas there could be another one that is the ownership has changed and there's a new UBO, therefore that does need to change the risk rating, or it requires an action to be taken. And part of the perpetual KYC is then identifying what is that action that should be taken and how do we automate that action as much as possible. So in the case of a new UBO is identified, and we've identified that because Bolagsverket has told us that there's a new UBO within a company, then we should then be able to have an automated process that then contacts the customer and says, we understand that you have a new UBO, would you like to tell us more, can you provide us the information? And we should be able to do that as light touch as possible, so with as minimum in as automated way as possible. And the key thing there is about understanding, well, a few things. One is, well, where does the risk change? So what combination of events that come through internal data, i.e. transactions, or external data contributes to a risk change or the requirement for the bank to do something or the financial institution to do something. That's what I think of as being perpetual KYC.
Brilliant. And what are the inherent challenges about such a setup?
I think it's carrying on from the previous theme, which is what are those combinations that require an intervention, and being able to identify, again, kind of using the example of moving from one street to another in Stockholm, is if they move from a high risk area or a low risk area in Stockholm to a high risk area, or they move, that one example could be they move their headquarters from a perfectly respectable building to a building that's been flagged as having a high number of corporate mailboxes and therefore raises a potential risk flag. How do you actually get that data, and how do you assess whether that is a material change that requires intervention? And depending on the customer type, whether for one type of customer, whether that is a high risk change, but for another customer it may be a low risk change. So I think it's that combination, it's that risk model that sits in the middle that is able to interpret those different data changes and say which are the ones that are material that we need to do something about. So I'd say that's challenge number one, is that risk model, and then the second is getting the actual data. What are those data sources? You can get the data from your transaction monitoring systems, but then those external data changes, where do you source the data from that is reliable enough that you can make those kind of decisions on?
Brilliant. So what are your top 3 tips for anybody wanting to get their KYC set up in order and are just starting out now?
I think number one is understand what the immediate what are the challenges that you're facing, and recognize where you are today. A lot of organizations aim they could be at level 1 maturity and they're aiming for level 5 maturity. They're trying to shoot for the stars and get to that utopian place straight away. So I think it's number 1 is understand where you are. I think number 2 is around you need to get that standard agreed, as I mentioned, and say what should our KYC AML processes look like, and get some form of agreement on that process. And then I think the third part is then coming up with a realistic plan as to how we're going to get from A to B. What are those priorities? So we need to make sure that, again, it's slicing the elephant. It's working out how do you put it into manageable chunks, and how do you get the right stakeholders in place in order to govern that change.
Great answers. And lastly, I wanted to ask for the companies who actually have a good KYC/AML setup today, but are looking to make this even more sort of built for the future. What's the one advice you'd like to give them?
I think there's always opportunity for improvement. It's about how do you use your data in a smart way in order to improve your combination of operational efficiency and your operational effectiveness. The effectiveness being how well are you identifying the criminal activity, and the operational efficiency is with what level of effort are you doing that. So I think it's thinking about those two axes and saying whereabouts are we on them, what can we do to continue to move the dial to move up the efficiency and effectiveness sort of axes.
Absolutely. Well, Martin, it's been brilliant talking to you today. This 30 minutes just flew by. I'm super excited to talk to you again on a later point.
Thank you very much. It's been a fun discussion.
Yeah, money make a world go round.